"You'll sign these papers or you'll regret it," my husband snarled, shoving the custody documents toward me as our daughter's birthday guests watched in horror. When I refused, he pushed me down the marble staircase in front of everyone. 3 years later, I was sitting in that same courthouse, but this time, I was the one with full custody, and he was the one facing criminal charges. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and for 8 years, I lived what everyone else believed was the perfect life. My husband, Michael Patterson, was a prominent corporate attorney with Pearson Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in Denver. We lived in a sprawling colonial house in Cherry Hills Village, complete with manicured gardens, a 3-car garage, and the kind of security system that made our neighbors feel safe, just knowing we were nearby. From the outside, we represented everything American success was supposed to look like. Michael drove a black BMW sedan that he replaced every 2 years. I maintained our social calendar with the precision of a military operation, organizing charity galas, school fundraisers, and dinner parties that were photographed for the society pages of Denver Magazine. Our daughter, Sophia, attended the exclusive Windward Academy, where tuition cost more than most people's annual salaries. But perfection, I learned, is often just an elaborate stage production designed to hide the rot underneath. The first time Michael hit me was 6 months after our wedding, during what should have been our honeymoon period. I had questioned his decision to spend our entire savings on a new boat instead of the house down payment we had discussed. The slap came so suddenly that I convinced myself it was an accident, a reflexive reaction to stress rather than a deliberate choice to hurt me. He apologized with such genuine remorse that I believed his tears were proof that it would never happen again. I was 24 years old, fresh out of graduate school with a master's degree in child psychology, and naive enough to think that love could solve problems that required much more sophisticated solutions. Michael was 32, established in his career, and skilled in the kind of manipulation that makes victims question their own perceptions of reality. The pattern that developed over the following years was as predictable as it was devastating. Michael would gradually increase his control over various aspects of my life, using a combination of financial leverage, social isolation, and psychological manipulation that was so subtle I barely noticed it happening. When I would finally recognize what was occurring and attempt to assert some independence, he would escalate to physical violence, followed immediately by apologies, gifts, and promises that created just enough hope to keep me trapped in the cycle. By the time Sophia was born 3 years into our marriage, I had become an expert at covering bruises with makeup, explaining away broken household items, and maintaining the cheerful demeanor that our social circle expected from Michael Patterson's wife. Motherhood should have been my liberation. Finally, I had someone who needed me more than I needed Michael's approval. Instead, it became another weapon he could use against me. "You know what happens to mothers who cannot provide stable homes for their children," Michael would say during our arguments, his voice carrying the authority of someone who spent his professional life navigating family court. "Judges do not look kindly on women who make accusations they cannot prove." The threat was both specific and vague enough to be terrifying. Michael specialized in corporate law, but he had enough colleagues in family practice to understand exactly how custody battles could be weaponized against vulnerable mothers. He knew which judges were sympathetic to fathers' rights arguments, which psychological evaluators could be influenced by professional reputation, and which private investigators could uncover the kind of personal information that could destroy a woman's credibility in court. For years, I convinced myself that I was protecting Sophia by maintaining the facade of our happy marriage. She attended excellent schools, lived in a beautiful home, and had access to opportunities that my own middle-class upbringing had never provided. Michael was charming and attentive when other people were watching, and Sophia genuinely loved the father she saw during public appearances and special occasions. What she did not see were the late-night arguments that ended with me sleeping in the guest room, the way her father's mood could shift from affectionate to menacing within seconds, or the careful choreography I performed every day to avoid triggering his anger. Children are remarkably perceptive, but they are also remarkably adaptable, and Sophia learned to navigate our household dynamics with the same cautious awareness that I had developed. The turning point came when Sophia turned 7 and began asking questions that I could not answer without lying. Why did Mommy sometimes have bruises? Why did Daddy get so angry when Mommy talked to other adults? Why did we always leave family gatherings early when Mommy seemed to be enjoying herself? I realized that my attempts to protect Sophia from the truth about our marriage were actually teaching her that this kind of relationship was normal. She was learning that fathers had the right to control mothers, that women should accept mistreatment to maintain family stability, and that love and fear could coexist in the same relationship. That realization should have motivated me to leave immediately, but the practical obstacles seemed insurmountable. Michael controlled all of our financial accounts, monitored my communications, and had convinced most of our mutual friends that I was emotionally unstable and prone to exaggeration. When I had tentatively mentioned to my sister that I was having marital problems, Michael had somehow learned about the conversation and punished me by canceling a planned visit with my parents that Sophia had been anticipating for months. "Your family thinks you are becoming paranoid," he told me that night, his tone suggesting disappointment rather than anger. "They are worried about how your behavior might be affecting Sophia." I later learned that Michael had called my sister and my parents to express concern about my mental health, describing fictional incidents where I had displayed erratic behavior or made unreasonable demands. He was careful to frame his narrative as reluctant disclosure from a concerned husband rather than malicious gossip, which made his lies more credible, and my eventual denials seemed defensive. The isolation was methodical and complete. Michael had convinced my family that I was unstable, my friends that I was ungrateful, and my professional contacts that I was unreliable. When Sophia started 2nd grade, I had no meaningful relationships outside our household and no financial resources that Michael did not control. But isolation, while devastating, also provided unexpected opportunities for observation and learning. With no social distractions to occupy my time, I began paying closer attention to Michael's professional activities, his communication patterns, and the legal strategies he used in his corporate practice. I listened to his phone calls, read his emails when he left his computer unlocked, and gradually developed an understanding of how he built cases, identified weaknesses in opposing arguments, and leveraged information to achieve favorable outcomes. Michael was brilliant at his job, but he was also predictable. He approached every conflict with the same systematic methodology: gather information, identify leverage points, apply pressure strategically, and negotiate from a position of strength. The problem was that he had been using these same tactics against me for years, and I was finally beginning to understand the game well enough to recognize the rules. The revelation that changed everything came during Sophia's 7th birthday party planning. Michael had insisted on hosting the celebration at our house, inviting not just Sophia's classmates, but also his colleagues and their families. The guest list included 2 family court judges, 3 divorce attorneys, and several child psychologists who worked as expert witnesses in custody cases. "It is important for people to see what kind of family we are," Michael explained when I questioned the elaborate guest list for a child's birthday party. "Sophia deserves to be surrounded by successful, stable adults who can serve as positive influences in her life." I realized that Michael was not planning a birthday party. He was staging a performance designed to establish his credibility as a devoted father and my dependence as a grateful wife. Every detail of the event was calculated to reinforce the narrative he had been building about our family dynamics. The expensive decorations demonstrated his financial success. The guest list established his professional connections. My role as hostess would showcase my domestic capabilities while keeping me too busy to engage in meaningful conversations with potential allies. But Michael had made a critical error in his strategic planning. He had become so confident in his control over our household that he had grown careless about hiding his true nature. The birthday party he intended as a showcase for his paternal devotion would instead become the stage for his complete destruction. The morning of Sophia's birthday party, Michael presented me with a legal document that I had never seen before. The papers were titled Voluntary Custody Modification Agreement and contained language that would transfer primary physical custody of Sophia to Michael while limiting my parenting time to supervised visits every other weekend. "This is just a formality," Michael said, his tone suggesting casual importance rather than life-altering significance. "My attorney says it will be helpful for tax purposes if I am listed as Sophia's primary guardian." I read the document 3 times before the full implications became clear. The agreement was not about taxes, it was about control. By signing these papers, I would be voluntarily surrendering my rights as Sophia's mother and acknowledging that Michael was the more suitable parent. If I ever tried to challenge the arrangement later, the voluntary nature of the initial agreement would be used as evidence that I had recognized my own inadequacy as a caregiver. "I need time to think about this," I said carefully, knowing that any direct refusal would trigger Michael's anger. "There is nothing to think about," Michael replied, his voice taking on the edge that always preceded violence. "The guests will be arriving in 3 hours, and this needs to be signed and notarized before then." The timeline was not coincidental. Michael had chosen Sophia's birthday party as the deadline because he knew I would be less likely to create conflict on our daughter's special day. He was gambling that maternal guilt would override my instinct for self-preservation, and that social pressure would prevent me from causing a scene in front of his carefully selected audience. But Michael had miscalculated the depth of my desperation, and the clarity that comes from finally understanding that you have nothing left to lose. For 8 years, I had sacrificed my own well-being to maintain the illusion of family stability. I had accepted abuse, isolation, and humiliation because I believed that protecting Sophia required maintaining our marriage. Now I understood that the greatest threat to Sophia's well-being was not the disruption of our family structure. It was the continuation of a relationship that was teaching her that women existed to serve men's interests, and that love required accepting unacceptable treatment. The birthday party would proceed as planned, but not according to Michael's script. Instead of signing away my rights as Sophia's mother, I was going to reclaim my voice as a woman who deserved better. The audience Michael had assembled to witness my submission would instead observe his exposure as the controlling, abusive man he had always been beneath the professional facade. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I did not know then that my refusal to sign those papers would lead to a physical assault that left me hospitalized, a custody battle that lasted 2 years, and a legal victory that would change not just my life but the lives of other women facing similar circumstances. All I knew was that I had finally reached the moment where fear of the unknown had become less powerful than certainty about the unacceptable nature of my current situation. The birthday party was scheduled to begin at 2 p.m. By 1:45, the first guests were arriving, and Michael was growing increasingly agitated about the unsigned papers. Sophia was upstairs in her bedroom, getting dressed in the princess costume she had chosen for her celebration, completely unaware that her 7th birthday would mark the beginning of her parents' final confrontation. I stood in our kitchen, holding the custody modification agreement in my hands, and made the decision that would either destroy my life or finally allow me to begin living it. Either way, I was about to discover what existed beyond the boundaries of fear that had defined my world for 8 years. The sound of the doorbell announced the arrival of more guests, and Michael's footsteps on the marble floor indicated that he was coming to collect the signed papers that would complete his systematic destruction of my autonomy. Instead, he was about to encounter the first word I had spoken with complete conviction in nearly a decade: no. The word no hung in the air between Michael and me like a declaration of war. I watched his face transform from confident expectation to disbelief, then to the cold fury that I had learned to recognize as the precursor to violence. But this time, instead of the familiar terror that usually accompanied that expression, I felt something entirely different. A crystalline clarity that comes from finally understanding that you have reached the absolute boundary of what you can endure. "What did you say?" Michael's voice was dangerously quiet, the tone he used in court when he was about to deliver a devastating cross-examination. I said no. I will not sign these papers. Quote, the custody modification agreement fluttered to the granite countertop as I released it, the sound of paper against stone marking the end of 8 years of compliance and the beginning of whatever came next. Through the kitchen window, I could see more guests arriving for Sophia's party, their cheerful voices carrying across our perfectly manicured lawn as they approached the front door, completely unaware that they were about to witness the destruction of everything they believed about the Patterson family. Michael stepped closer, and I could see the calculation behind his eyes as he weighed his options. We were no longer alone in the house. Judge Catherine Walsh had arrived 10 minutes earlier with her husband and twin daughters. Dr. Amanda Foster, the child psychologist who had evaluated dozens of custody cases, was helping her son hang his jacket in our front closet. Michael's own colleagues from Pearson Associates were scattered throughout our living room, admiring the elaborate birthday decorations and discussing their latest legal victories. For the first time in our marriage, Michael could not simply escalate to physical violence without consequences. His carefully cultivated professional reputation was literally standing in our living room, and any loss of control would be witnessed by the exact people whose opinions mattered most to his career advancement. "Elena, you are being unreasonable," Michael said, his voice modulated to carry just enough volume that anyone passing near the kitchen would hear a man attempting to reason with a difficult wife, rather than a predator cornering his prey. "We have guests arriving for our daughter's birthday party. This is not the time for dramatics." The word dramatics struck me like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because it perfectly encapsulated the gaslighting that had defined our relationship. Every time I had expressed pain, fear, or disagreement, Michael had reframed my emotions as performance rather than genuine experience. My tears were manipulation. My fear was exaggeration. My request for basic respect were unreasonable demands. But something had fundamentally shifted in my understanding during the moments between reading those custody papers and speaking my refusal aloud. I realized that Michael's power over me was not actually based on his superior intelligence, financial control, or legal expertise. It was based entirely on my willingness to accept his definition of reality instead of trusting my own perceptions. "You are right," I said quietly. "This is not the time for dramatics. It is the time for honesty." I walked past Michael toward the kitchen island where I had left my purse, moving with the deliberate calm of someone who has finally stopped trying to avoid conflict. Inside my purse was my phone, and on that phone was the number for the domestic violence hotline that I had memorized 6 months earlier but never had the courage to call. "Where are you going?" Michael demanded, his careful modulation beginning to slip. "I am going to call my attorney." The lie came so easily that I surprised myself. I did not have an attorney. I did not even have access to the financial resources necessary to hire one. But Michael did not know that I was bluffing, and the mere suggestion that I might have independent legal representation was enough to crack his composure. "You do not need an attorney, Elena. I am an attorney. I can explain anything you do not understand about these papers." "You are not my attorney, Michael. You are Sophia's father, and there is a significant conflict of interest in those roles when it comes to custody arrangements." The legal terminology was not accidental. Over the past several months, I had been teaching myself family law through online resources, legal databases, and court documents that were matters of public record. I had spent countless hours researching cases similar to our situation, learning the language that judges used when making custody determinations, and understanding the factors that courts considered when evaluating parental fitness. Michael stared at me as if I had begun speaking a foreign language. In his mind, I was still the frightened young woman he had married 8 years earlier, someone who deferred to his expertise and accepted his judgment without question. He had no framework for understanding the person I was becoming, because he had never bothered to learn who I actually was beneath the role I had been playing. "Elena, you are embarrassing yourself," Michael said, his voice rising slightly as he heard the sound of more guests entering our front hallway. "Put your phone away and sign the papers. We can discuss your concerns later." But later never came in our relationship. Later was always postponed until after the current crisis, the important meeting, the social obligation, or the convenient moment that never actually arrived. I had been living in a perpetual state of delayed resolution, where my needs were always secondary to Michael's timeline, and my voice was always secondary to his convenience. "No," I repeated, and this time the word carried 8 years of accumulated strength. "I will not sign papers that give you primary custody of Sophia without legal representation. I will not pretend to agree with arrangements that I do not understand, and I will not continue to prioritize your comfort over my daughter's well-being." The transformation in Michael's expression was immediate and terrifying. The mask of reasonable professionalism that he wore in public situations slipped completely, revealing the cold rage that I had learned to associate with the worst moments of our marriage. But this time, instead of cowering or attempting to de-escalate, I stood my ground and met his gaze directly. "You have no idea what you are doing," Michael said, his voice now carrying the unmistakable threat that had intimidated me into submission countless times before. "You think you understand custody law? You think any judge in Colorado will believe your word against mine? You have no job, no income, no independent housing, and a documented history of emotional instability." The reference to documented history was not hyperbole. Michael had been methodically building a case against my fitness as a mother for months, creating medical records that supported a narrative of mental health issues, financial irresponsibility, and parental inadequacy. He had convinced our family doctor to prescribe anxiety medication after describing symptoms that I had never actually reported. He had opened credit cards in my name and deliberately missed payments to damage my financial credibility. He had even scheduled counseling sessions where he expressed concern about my ability to provide stable care for Sophia. But Michael's greatest tactical error was assuming that I had remained ignorant of his strategy. Because I had no social life or professional obligations outside our household, I had unlimited time to observe and analyze his behavior. I had been learning his methods, studying his approach, and gradually understanding that his strength lay not in his inherent superiority, but in his willingness to use weapons that I had been too ethical to consider. "You are absolutely right," I said calmly. "I have no job, no income, and no independent housing. But I do have something that you apparently forgot about. What is that supposed to mean?" I smiled for the first time in months. Not with happiness, but with the grim satisfaction of someone who had finally discovered their opponent's weakness. "I have witnesses." The sound of children's laughter echoed from our living room as Sophia and her friends began arriving for the party. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see Judge Walsh's daughters examining the elaborate birthday decorations while their mother chatted with Dr. Foster about recent changes in family court procedures. Michael's colleagues were sampling the catered appetizers and discussing their latest corporate acquisitions with the casual confidence of men who had never questioned their right to control other people's lives. "These people know you, Michael. They know your professional reputation, your community standing, and your public persona. But they do not know how you treat your wife when you think no one is watching." Michael's face had gone white. For the first time in our marriage, I could see genuine fear in his eyes as he began to understand the implications of what I was suggesting. His entire career was built on the foundation of his personal credibility. Family law judges trusted him to negotiate complex custody arrangements because they believed he understood the importance of family stability. Corporate clients paid him enormous fees because they trusted his judgment and integrity. If even one of the people in our living room witnessed him losing control, his carefully constructed professional identity would begin to unravel. And if that same person later learned about the patterns of abuse that had defined our marriage, the destruction would be complete. "You would not dare," Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Try me." The standoff that followed lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it felt like the culmination of 8 years of accumulated tension. Michael was calculating whether I had the courage to follow through on my implicit threat, while I was discovering whether I actually possessed the strength that my words had claimed. The answer came when Sophia appeared in the kitchen doorway, resplendent in her princess costume and completely unaware of the drama unfolding between her parents. She looked from Michael to me with the expectant excitement of a 7-year-old who had been anticipating the celebration for weeks. "Mommy, Daddy, everyone is here for my party. Can we start with the games now?" The sight of our daughter, innocent and trusting, crystallized everything that was at stake in this moment. I was not just fighting for my own freedom from an abusive marriage. I was fighting for Sophia's right to grow up believing that women deserved respect, that relationships should be based on mutual care rather than control, and that no one had the right to demand submission through threats or violence. Michael looked at Sophia, then back at me, and I could see him making a calculation that would determine the course of all our lives. He could maintain his composure, accept my refusal to sign the custody papers, and deal with the consequences through legal channels. Or he could abandon the pretense of civility and reveal his true nature in front of the very people whose opinions mattered most to his professional future. His choice surprised no one who truly understood the psychology of abusive men. When their control is threatened, they inevitably choose escalation over strategic retreat, immediate gratification over long-term consequences, and the satisfaction of inflicting pain over the preservation of their own interests. "Sophia, go back to your friends," Michael said, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "Mommy and Daddy need to finish discussing some grown-up business. But Daddy, you promised we could start the treasure hunt at 2:30, and it is already. Go. Now." The harshness in Michael's tone startled Sophia, who looked between us with the confused hurt of a child who had done nothing wrong but was being treated as if she had. I watched her face crumple slightly as she backed out of the kitchen, and in that moment, I understood that my decision to refuse signing those papers was not just about protecting my own rights as Sophia's mother. It was about teaching her that she never had to accept unacceptable treatment from anyone, regardless of their relationship to her or their position of authority. "You see what you have done?" Michael hissed once Sophia was out of sight. "You have upset our daughter on her birthday because you cannot control your need for attention." The accusation was so perfectly inverted from reality that I almost laughed. Michael had spent 8 years demanding my constant attention, while systematically destroying my ability to seek attention from anyone else. He had isolated me from friends, family, and professional colleagues, then blamed me for being needy when I looked to him for social and emotional connection. He had created the dependency that he now criticized, then used that criticism to justify further control. "I will not sign those papers," I repeated. "And I will not pretend that refusing to give away my parental rights is somehow selfish or attention-seeking behavior." Michael moved closer, and I could smell his cologne mixed with the metallic scent of adrenaline that I had learned to associate with his most dangerous moods. "You will sign them, Elena. One way or another, you will sign them." Quote, "Are you threatening me?" "I am explaining reality to you." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway as Dr. Foster approached the kitchen, probably looking for ice or napkins or some other party necessity. Michael immediately shifted his expression to the warm smile that he used for professional interactions. But the transition was too quick and too complete to be convincing to anyone who had witnessed the preceding moments. "Everything all right in here?" Dr. Foster asked, her trained psychologist's eye taking in the tension that still hung in the air between us. "Perfect," Michael replied smoothly. "Elena was just having some concerns about a legal document, but I think we have resolved everything." Dr. Foster looked at me expectantly, waiting for confirmation of Michael's assessment. This was the moment I had been unconsciously preparing for throughout our entire marriage. I could smile, nod, and resume the performance that had protected me from Michael's worst impulses while enabling his continued control over our lives. Or I could tell the truth and accept whatever consequences followed. "Actually," I said, my voice steadier than I had expected, "we have not resolved anything. Michael wants me to sign custody papers that I have not had the opportunity to review with independent legal counsel, and he is becoming increasingly agitated about my refusal to comply with his timeline." The silence that followed was the sound of 8 years of carefully maintained pretense beginning to collapse. Dr. Foster was not just a random party guest. She was a mandated reporter whose professional obligations required her to document evidence of potential child endangerment or domestic violence. She was also someone who had evaluated hundreds of custody cases and understood the warning signs of manipulative behavior in family dynamics. "Perhaps," Dr. Foster said carefully, "this would be better handled at a different time, when you both have had the opportunity to consider all the implications." Michael's smile became fixed and artificial. "Of course. Elena sometimes gets overwhelmed by legal language, but there is really no urgency. The papers can wait." But I had already crossed the line from performance to authenticity, and there was no returning to the safety of pretense. "There is urgency, Dr. Foster. Michael has made it clear that these papers must be signed today, before the party ends, and that refusing to sign them will have serious consequences for me." "What kind of consequences?" Dr. Foster's voice had taken on the professional tone that indicated she was no longer making casual conversation but conducting an informal assessment. Michael realized that the situation was spiraling beyond his control. His attempt to pressure me into signing the custody papers in front of witnesses had backfired completely, creating exactly the kind of public scrutiny that he had spent years avoiding. Instead of establishing his authority over our family dynamics, he had revealed the threatening behavior that undermined his credibility as a reasonable father and husband. "Elena is exaggerating," Michael said, but his voice lacked the conviction that had made his previous lies persuasive. "She becomes anxious about legal matters and sometimes misinterprets normal conversation as threatening." The gaslighting was so blatant that even someone without Dr. Foster's professional training would have recognized it as manipulation. Michael was attempting to reframe my accurate description of his behavior as evidence of my mental instability, using the same strategy that had worked effectively when we were alone but that appeared pathological when deployed in front of a neutral observer. "I see," Dr. Foster said neutrally. "Elena, how would you describe the conversation you and Michael were having before I arrived?" This was my opportunity to speak the truth about our relationship, to explain the patterns of control and intimidation that had defined our marriage, and to ask for the help that I had been too frightened to seek for 8 years. But it was also the moment when I would either commit fully to the path of resistance or retreat into the familiar safety of enabling Michael's narrative about our family dynamics. I thought about Sophia dressed in her princess costume and waiting for her birthday celebration to begin. I thought about the example I was setting for her, about how women should respond to threatening behavior from men who claim to love them. I thought about the choice between protecting myself from Michael's immediate anger and protecting my daughter from learning that mothers existed to absorb abuse in service of family stability. "Michael told me that I would sign the custody papers one way or another," I said clearly. When I asked if he was threatening me, he said he was explaining reality. I interpreted that as a threat of consequences if I continued to refuse his demands. Dr. Foster nodded slowly. "And what did you understand those consequences might be?" Before I could answer, Michael exploded with the rage that he had been suppressing since the conversation began. "This is ridiculous. Elena is creating drama on our daughter's birthday because she cannot handle normal adult discussions about legal paperwork." He stepped toward me with the aggressive posture that I had learned to recognize as the prelude to physical violence. But this time, instead of cowering or attempting to de-escalate, I stood my ground. And this time, we were not alone. "Michael, step back," Dr. Foster said firmly, her professional authority cutting through his angry momentum. But Michael was beyond the point where reasonable intervention could redirect his behavior. 8 years of unchallenged control had created a sense of entitlement that could not accommodate public resistance to his authority. In his mind, I was still his property. Dr. Foster was an unwelcome intrusion into private family matters, and the solution to both problems was the application of force that had always worked before. He grabbed my arm with enough violence to leave bruises, his fingers digging into the exact spot where he had left similar marks a week earlier. "You will sign those papers now, Elena. We are not doing this in front of Sophia's friends. Let go of me. Sign the papers. Let go of me, Michael." Quote, but Michael had passed the point of rational decision-making. The combination of public humiliation, loss of control, and professional embarrassment had triggered the kind of explosive rage that made him incapable of considering consequences or calculating risks. He was operating on pure impulse, driven by the need to re-establish dominance regardless of who might be watching. What happened next would be witnessed by Dr. Foster, recorded by the security cameras that Michael had installed throughout our house, and eventually presented as evidence in the criminal trial that would destroy his career and reputation. But in the moment, all I knew was that 8 years of fear had finally been replaced by something stronger, the absolute certainty that I would never again allow anyone to treat me as if my consent was optional. The struggle that followed lasted less than 30 seconds, but it would change the trajectory of all our lives forever. The moment Michael's hand closed around my arm with deliberate violence, everything that had been theoretical about our confrontation became viscerally real. His grip was calculated to cause maximum pain while leaving minimal visible evidence, a technique he had perfected through years of practice. But this time, for the first time in our marriage, his violence had a witness, whose professional obligations would not allow her to ignore what she had observed. "Michael, release Elena immediately. Drive." Foster commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. Her presence transformed our kitchen from a private space where Michael could operate without accountability into a professional environment where his behavior would be evaluated according to clinical standards for parental fitness and emotional stability. Michael's response revealed the extent to which his sense of entitlement had distorted his judgment. Instead of recognizing that Dr. Foster's intervention represented an opportunity to de-escalate before causing irreversible damage to his reputation, he interpreted her presence as another challenge to his authority that required immediate suppression. "This is a private family matter," Michael snarled, his grip on my arm tightening as he spoke. "Elena is my wife, and she will respect my decisions regarding our daughter's welfare." The statement was remarkable for its complete inversion of legal reality. Under Colorado law, both parents possessed equal rights and responsibilities regarding their child's welfare, and no spouse possessed legal authority to compel the other to sign custody modifications without independent representation. Michael's assertion that I was obligated to respect his decisions revealed his fundamental belief that marriage conferred ownership rights over women's autonomy and children's futures. Dr. Foster moved closer, her professional training enabling her to recognize the escalating danger in Michael's posture and tone. "Michael, what you are describing is not legally accurate. Elena has independent rights as Sophia's mother, and she has clearly stated that she wants legal counsel before signing any custody agreements. She does not need legal counsel. I am an attorney. You are not her attorney, and you cannot represent her interests when they conflict with your own." The exchange might have continued indefinitely if Michael had retained even minimal self-control. Dr. Foster was offering him multiple opportunities to step back from the confrontation, acknowledge the legitimacy of my concerns, and agree to postpone the custody discussion until proper legal procedures could be followed. Any reasonable person would have recognized that her suggestions provided a face-saving exit from an increasingly untenable situation. But Michael had never learned to accept challenges to his authority with grace or strategic thinking. His entire identity was built around the assumption that his superior intelligence, professional status, and masculine dominance entitled him to immediate compliance from women, children, and anyone else he perceived as subordinate. The possibility that I might possess independent rights that could override his preferences was literally incomprehensible to his worldview. "Elena will sign these papers today," Michael declared, with the finality of someone announcing natural law rather than personal preference. "She has neither the intelligence nor the resources to challenge my decisions in court, and any attempt to do so will result in consequences that she cannot afford to face." The threat was both vague and specific enough to be terrifying. Michael was simultaneously acknowledging that he expected me to challenge his custody demands while promising retaliation that would be swift and devastating. He was confident that his professional connections, financial resources, and understanding of legal procedures would enable him to destroy any resistance I might attempt to mount. But Michael's greatest tactical error was delivering these threats in the presence of Dr. Foster, whose professional obligations required her to document evidence of intimidating behavior toward family members. She was not just a party guest who might gossip about our marital problems. She was a mandated reporter whose testimony could be subpoenaed if custody proceedings ever reached family court. "Michael," Dr. Foster said carefully, "you are describing behavior that would be considered coercive and potentially abusive in a custody evaluation. I strongly recommend that you step back and allow Elena the time and space she has requested to consult with independent counsel." Her words struck Michael like physical blows. Throughout his legal career, he had been the person delivering devastating assessments of other people's parental fitness. He had represented clients in custody battles where opposing parents were deemed unfit based on evidence of controlling behavior, financial manipulation, and emotional intimidation. He understood exactly how Dr. Foster's observations could be weaponized against him if this confrontation ever became part of an official record. The realization that his own behavior was being evaluated according to the same standards he had used to destroy other parents should have motivated immediate de-escalation. Instead, it triggered the kind of explosive rage that emerges when someone who has never questioned their own righteousness suddenly confronts evidence of their fundamental wrongness. "You have no authority in this house," Michael shouted at Dr. Foster, his voice loud enough to carry throughout our home and certainly audible to the party guests in adjacent rooms. "Elena is manipulating the situation to make me appear unreasonable, just as she manipulates every disagreement to cast herself as a victim." The accusation of manipulation was particularly revealing because it demonstrated Michael's complete inability to recognize irony. He was simultaneously claiming that I was manipulating the situation while using physical force to compel my compliance with his demands. He was accusing me of casting myself as a victim while actively victimizing me in front of a professional witness. His lack of self-awareness was so profound that he apparently believed his own narrative, even while contradicting it through his actions. Dr. Foster's response was measured and professional, but I could see the clinical assessment occurring behind her calm exterior. She was observing Michael's behavior through the lens of her extensive experience evaluating parents in high-conflict custody situations, and what she was witnessing clearly fell into categories that would raise serious concerns about his fitness as a primary caregiver. "Michael, I am not making any judgments about the legitimacy of Elena's concerns," Dr. Foster said evenly. "I am simply observing that she has requested time to obtain legal representation before signing documents that would significantly alter her parental rights, and that this request appears reasonable and appropriate under the circumstances." "There are no circumstances that justify defying her husband's judgment about their child's welfare," Michael replied, apparently unaware that his statement perfectly encapsulated the patriarchal assumptions that family courts had been moving away from for decades. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps as Judge Catherine Walsh entered our kitchen, clearly drawn by the raised voices that had become audible throughout the first floor of our house. Her arrival transformed an already serious situation into a potential career-ending catastrophe for Michael, who suddenly found himself being evaluated by one of the most respected family court judges in Colorado. "Is everything all right?" Judge Walsh asked, her judicial instincts immediately assessing the tension in the room and the obvious distress on my face. Michael's expression underwent a rapid transformation as he attempted to reassemble his professional persona, but the transition was too abrupt and too dramatic to be convincing. His grip on my arm loosened slightly, though he did not release me entirely, and his voice dropped to a more socially acceptable volume. "Everything is fine, Your Honor," Michael said, unconsciously slipping into the formal address he used in her courtroom. "Elena and I were having a discussion about some paperwork, but we have resolved our differences." Quote, Judge Walsh's gaze moved from Michael to me, and I could see her taking in the details that would matter in a legal context. My obvious distress, Michael's continued grip on my arm, the custody papers scattered on the kitchen counter, and Dr. Foster's professional presence as a witness to whatever had been transpiring before her arrival. "Elena," Judge Walsh said directly, "do you feel that your differences have been resolved?" The question was simple, but its implications were enormous. Judge Walsh was offering me an opportunity to contradict Michael's characterization of our interaction, to request assistance from someone with the authority to provide it, and to establish an official record of what had been occurring in our kitchen. She was also offering me the chance to remain silent, to accept Michael's narrative and to avoid the consequences that would inevitably follow if I chose to challenge his version of events. I looked at Michael, whose expression clearly communicated the retaliation I could expect if I chose to speak honestly about our situation. I looked at Dr. Foster, whose professional presence represented the possibility of validation and support that I had been denied throughout our marriage. I looked at Judge Walsh, whose judicial authority represented the legal protection that I had never believed would be available to someone in my circumstances. But most importantly, I thought about Sophia, who was somewhere in our house celebrating her 7th birthday, while her parents engaged in a confrontation that would determine whether she grew up believing that women possessed independent rights, or that they existed to enable men's control over family decisions. "No, Your Honor," I said clearly. "Our differences have not been resolved. Michael is demanding that I sign custody papers that would give him primary physical custody of Sophia, and he has made it clear that refusing to sign them will result in serious consequences for me." The silence that followed was the sound of 8 years of carefully maintained secrecy being replaced by official scrutiny. Judge Walsh was no longer a party guest making polite conversation. She was a judicial officer who had just received a report of potentially coercive behavior regarding child custody matters, and her professional obligations required her to take such reports seriously. "Michael," Judge Walsh said, her tone shifting to the authoritative voice she used when addressing attorneys who appeared before her court, "is Elena's characterization accurate?" Michael realized that his entire career was balanced on the edge of his next words. He could acknowledge that he had been pressuring me to sign custody papers without legal representation, which would be ethically problematic but not necessarily career-ending. Or he could deny my account, which would require him to either discredit my credibility or explain why two professional witnesses were corroborating a version of events that contradicted his own. His choice revealed everything about his character and judgment. Instead of accepting responsibility for his behavior and attempting to de-escalate the situation, Michael doubled down on his narrative of my unreasonableness and emotional instability. Elena becomes anxious about legal matters and often misinterprets routine discussions as threatening, Michael said, apparently believing that he could gaslight his way out of a situation where multiple witnesses had observed his behavior. The custody papers are a simple formality for tax purposes, but she has worked herself into an emotional state that makes rational conversation impossible. The explanation was so obviously false that it insulted the intelligence of everyone present. Judge Walsh had spent decades evaluating testimony in family court proceedings, and she possessed the professional expertise to recognize manipulation when she encountered it. Dr. Foster had witnessed the entire confrontation and could provide detailed testimony about Michael's threatening behavior and my reasonable responses. "I see," Judge Walsh said neutrally. "Elena, would you like to call an attorney to review these papers before making any decisions about signing them?" Michael's reaction to that suggestion was immediate and revealing. "That is completely unnecessary, Your Honor. I have reviewed the papers thoroughly, and they contain standard language that any competent attorney would approve." Elena's insistence on independent counsel is simply another example of her refusal to trust my professional judgment. The assertion that I should trust his professional judgment regarding legal documents that would limit my own parental rights was so breathtakingly inappropriate that Judge Walsh's expression shifted to barely concealed astonishment. Michael was essentially arguing that being married to an attorney negated my right to independent legal representation, a position that violated every ethical principle governing family law practice. "Michael," Judge Walsh said carefully, "you cannot represent Elena's interests in custody matters when those interests potentially conflict with your own. She has an absolute right to independent counsel, and her request for such counsel is not only reasonable but legally prudent." The judicial rebuke should have prompted immediate retreat and apology. Instead, it triggered the final explosion of rage that would transform our daughter's birthday party into a crime scene, and Michael's legal career into a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked privilege and entitlement. "Elena does not have rights that supersede my authority as Sophia's father and the primary financial provider for this family," Michael declared, his voice rising to a shout that was certainly audible throughout our house. "She will sign these papers today, or she will face consequences that will make her regret her defiance." The threat was delivered in the presence of a sitting family court judge and a licensed psychologist who specialized in custody evaluations. Michael had essentially confessed to planning retaliation against me for exercising my legal rights, while demonstrating the kind of controlling behavior that family courts had been trained to recognize as evidence of potential domestic violence. But Michael was beyond rational consideration of consequences. The combination of public humiliation, professional embarrassment, and loss of control had triggered a psychological break that made him incapable of strategic thinking. He was operating on pure rage, driven by the need to reestablish dominance regardless of who might be watching or what the long-term costs might be. When I attempted to step away from him to create physical distance, Michael's response was swift and decisive. He yanked me back toward him, with enough force to cause me to stumble, then pushed me away from him with sufficient violence that I lost my balance completely. The marble staircase that connected our kitchen to the main hallway had been one of the features that initially attracted us to this house. The stone was imported from Italy, the craftsmanship was exquisite, and the dramatic sweep of the stairs created an elegant architectural focal point that impressed visitors and enhanced our property value. But marble is unforgiving when human bodies collide with it at high velocity, and the sound of my impact echoed through our house with the finality of breaking glass. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, radiating from my left shoulder down through my ribs and into my hip where I had struck the stone steps. But more devastating than the physical injury was the realization that Michael had chosen violence in front of witnesses whose testimony could destroy him. He had sacrificed his career, his reputation, and his relationship with Sophia for the momentary satisfaction of inflicting pain on someone who had dared to defy his authority. The silence that followed my fall was broken by Dr. Foster's voice as she immediately moved to assess my injuries while simultaneously reaching for her phone to call emergency services. Judge Walsh was speaking in the calm, authoritative tone she used to manage courtroom crises, directing someone to check on Sophia and the other children, while ensuring that the scene was preserved for the police investigation that would inevitably follow. Michael stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at me with an expression that combined surprise, rage, and the dawning realization that he had just destroyed everything he had spent decades building. His violence had been witnessed by two of the most credible professionals in Colorado's family law system, recorded by the security cameras he had installed throughout our house, and observed by party guests whose testimony would corroborate every detail of the assault. But as I lay on those marble steps, fighting through the pain and shock of the impact, I experienced something unexpected: profound relief. For 8 years, I had been afraid that Michael's violence would escalate to the point where Sophia might be endangered, or I might be seriously injured. I had lived in constant fear of the moment when his control would slip and his true nature would be revealed in ways that could not be hidden or explained away. That moment had finally arrived. But instead of feeling helpless and afraid, I felt empowered by the knowledge that Michael had just provided me with all the evidence I would ever need to protect Sophia from his influence and control. His attempt to intimidate me into submission had instead become the foundation for my legal victory and his professional destruction. The birthday party that Michael had orchestrated to showcase his family's perfection had become the crime scene that would ensure Sophia's safety and my freedom. The witnesses he had assembled to validate his authority had instead become the testimony that would expose his true character and enable my ultimate triumph. As the sounds of sirens grew closer and the reality of Michael's situation became increasingly clear, I understood that my refusal to sign those custody papers had accomplished something far more significant than preventing immediate legal manipulation. It had forced Michael to reveal his authentic self in front of people whose opinions mattered more than temporary pain or professional embarrassment. The transformation from victim to victor had begun with a single word, but it would be completed through the testimony of credible witnesses and the weight of evidence that Michael himself had provided through his uncontrolled behavior. The emergency room at Denver Presbyterian Hospital became my first introduction to the systematic procedures that would define the next 2 years of my life. Within minutes of my arrival, what had been a private family crisis transformed into an official criminal investigation involving police detectives, medical professionals, social services personnel, and district attorney representatives who specialized in domestic violence prosecution. Detective Sarah Morrison arrived at the hospital 45 minutes after the ambulance had transported me from our house. She was a 15-year veteran of the Denver Police Department's domestic violence unit, a woman whose professional demeanor immediately conveyed both competence and genuine concern for victims who found themselves navigating the intersection of medical treatment and criminal justice procedures. "Mrs. Patterson, I am Detective Morrison," she said, settling into the chair beside my hospital bed with the practiced ease of someone who had conducted hundreds of similar interviews. "I understand that you were injured during an altercation at your home this afternoon. Before we discuss what happened, I want you to know that you are not required to speak with me today, and you can stop this conversation at any time if you need medical attention or feel uncomfortable continuing." The formal recitation of my rights represented a profound shift from the powerlessness I had experienced throughout my marriage. For 8 years, Michael had made unilateral decisions about what information I was allowed to share, which conversations I was permitted to have, and how I was expected to characterize our relationship to outside observers. Detective Morrison was offering me something I had not possessed since my wedding day: the legal authority to speak truthfully about my experiences without fear of immediate retaliation. "I want to tell you what happened," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice, despite the pain medication that had been administered to address my injuries. "But I need to know what this means for my daughter. Sophia was at the house when this occurred, and she has school tomorrow, and she needs someone to take care of her tonight." Detective Morrison nodded with understanding. "Sophia is currently with Dr. Amanda Foster, who was present during the incident and has temporary custody authorization through Child Protective Services. She will remain in Dr. Foster's care until we can establish a safe permanent arrangement. Your daughter is physically safe and has been told that you were injured, but that you are receiving medical treatment and will be fine. The relief that accompanied this information was overwhelming. Throughout the chaos of the ambulance ride and medical evaluation, my primary concern had been Sophia's immediate safety and emotional well-being. Michael's arrest had occurred within minutes of the police arrival at our house, but I had been transported to the hospital before learning whether appropriate arrangements had been made for Sophia's care. Dr. Foster volunteered to provide temporary care? I asked. Dr. Foster, Judge Walsh, and several other witnesses remained at your house until police and social services personnel could assess the situation and ensure that Sophia was not traumatized by what she had observed, Detective Morrison explained. According to their statements, Sophia was upstairs with other children during most of the incident and did not witness the actual assault, though she was aware that something serious had occurred between her parents. This information provided crucial context for understanding how the investigation would proceed. Sophia had been protected from witnessing the most traumatic aspects of Michael's violence, which would minimize her psychological trauma while also limiting her value as a witness in criminal proceedings. The burden of providing testimony would fall primarily on the adult witnesses who had observed Michael's behavior and could speak to the patterns of control and intimidation that had preceded the physical assault. Mrs. Patterson, I have preliminary statements from Dr. Foster and Judge Walsh regarding what they observed this afternoon, Detective Morrison continued. Their accounts are consistent and detailed, but I need to hear your version of events to complete the initial investigation report. Can you tell me what led to the confrontation with your husband? For the next 90 minutes, I provided Detective Morrison with a comprehensive account of the custody paper incident, Michael's threats and intimidating behavior, and the escalating confrontation that had culminated in the physical assault. But more importantly, I began to describe the broader context of our marriage, the patterns of control and manipulation that had defined our relationship, and the systematic isolation that had made me vulnerable to Michael's abuse. Detective Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her understanding of domestic violence dynamics and the legal elements that would be required to build a successful prosecution case. Her questions were professionally crafted to elicit specific details that would matter in court proceedings, while also helping me organize my thoughts in ways that would be useful for future legal testimony. Mrs. Patterson, you mentioned that Michael had threatened consequences if you refused to sign the custody papers. Did he specify what those consequences might involve? He said that I had no job, no income, no independent housing, and a documented history of emotional instability that would make any judge question my fitness as a mother. He said that challenging his decisions would result in consequences I could not afford to face. Did you interpret these statements as threats? Yes. Michael has spent months creating medical records that support a narrative of mental health problems I do not actually have, opening credit accounts in my name to damage my financial credibility, and building a case against my parental fitness that he could use if I ever tried to leave the marriage or challenge his authority. Detective Morrison's expression indicated that Michael's behavior fit established patterns that she had encountered in previous domestic violence cases. Abusers often spend months or years systematically undermining their victims' credibility, financial independence, and social support networks to make leaving the relationship appear impossible or prohibitively costly. Do you have documentation of any of these activities? I have copies of medical records that contain symptoms I never reported, credit card statements for accounts I never opened, and emails between Michael and various professionals, where he expressed concerns about my mental health and parenting capabilities that were completely fabricated. The existence of documentation would prove crucial for the investigation and eventual prosecution. Michael's systematic approach to building a case against me had created a paper trail that could be analyzed by forensic accountants, medical professionals, and psychiatric experts who could identify patterns of fabrication and manipulation that supported criminal charges beyond simple assault. Where do you keep these documents? In a safety deposit box at First National Bank that Michael does not know about. I started collecting evidence 6 months ago when I realized what he was doing. Detective Morrison smiled for the first time during our conversation. Mrs. Patterson, that was excellent strategic thinking. Those documents will be invaluable for establishing the broader context of coercive control that preceded today's assault. The validation was profound. For months, I had questioned whether my decision to secretly document Michael's behavior was paranoid, or whether my interpretation of his actions was accurate. Detective Morrison's professional assessment confirmed that my instincts had been sound, and that my preparation would significantly strengthen the case against Michael. What happens next in the investigation? We will execute search warrants for your house, Michael's office, and his computer records, to gather additional evidence of the threatening behavior and systematic manipulation you have described. We will interview all witnesses who were present during today's incident, and we will work with the district attorney's office to determine what charges are appropriate based on the evidence we collect. Quote, Detective Morrison explained that Michael was currently being held at the Denver County Jail on charges of third-degree assault, harassment, and child endangerment. Additional charges related to stalking, coercive control, or financial crimes could be added as the investigation proceeded and more evidence was analyzed. The child endangerment charge relates to Sophia's presence in the house during the assault. Colorado law considers domestic violence in the presence of children to be a form of child abuse, regardless of whether the child directly witnesses the violence. Sophia was in the house when her father committed assault against her mother, which creates additional legal consequences beyond the direct harm to you. This information represented a significant shift in how I understood the legal implications of Michael's behavior. Throughout our marriage, I had minimized the impact of his violence on Sophia because she had not been directly targeted or physically injured. Detective Morrison was explaining that Michael's abuse had legally harmed Sophia simply by occurring in her presence, which would factor into custody determinations and criminal sentencing decisions. What does this mean for custody arrangements while the criminal case proceeds? That will be determined through family court proceedings that are separate from the criminal investigation, but the evidence we gather will be available to the family court judge who makes custody decisions. Based on what I have observed so far, I expect that you will be awarded temporary sole custody with supervised visitation for your husband, assuming that you want to pursue that arrangement. The possibility of sole custody had seemed impossible just hours earlier when Michael was demanding that I sign papers that would have given him primary custody rights. His decision to escalate to violence in front of credible witnesses had completely reversed our legal positions and transformed me from a victim with limited options into a parent with strong grounds for protecting Sophia from further exposure to abusive behavior. I do want to pursue sole custody, but I am concerned about Michael's reaction when he realizes the full extent of the legal consequences he is facing. Detective Morrison's expression became serious. Mrs. Patterson, that is a legitimate concern that we take very seriously. Men who have used control and intimidation throughout their marriages often escalate their threatening behavior when they realize that legal proceedings are removing their power over their families. She explained that the Denver Police Department maintained a specialized unit for protecting domestic violence victims during the high-risk period immediately following arrests and charges. I would be provided with emergency contact numbers, safety planning resources, and regular check-ins from victim advocates, who could help me navigate the complex intersection of criminal proceedings, family court matters, and practical concerns about housing, financial support, and childcare arrangements. The most dangerous time for domestic violence victims is often the period immediately after they leave the relationship or initiate legal proceedings against their abusers, Detective Morrison continued. We have protocols in place to provide additional protection during this vulnerable period, and we will work with you to develop a comprehensive safety plan that addresses your specific circumstances. The safety planning conversation consumed another hour and covered topics I had never considered: secure communication methods, emergency housing options, financial account protection, workplace security measures, and legal procedures for obtaining restraining orders that would limit Michael's ability to contact or approach Sophia. Mrs. Patterson, I want you to understand that what happened today was not your fault, and your decision to refuse signing those custody papers was both legally appropriate and personally courageous. Many women in your situation feel guilty about the consequences that their abusers face when criminal charges are filed, but Michael's arrest and prosecution are the direct result of his own choices and behavior. The statement addressed feelings I had not yet fully acknowledged. Despite the relief I felt about Sophia's safety and my own protection, I was struggling with guilt about the destruction of Michael's career and the impact that his criminal charges would have on our extended family and social circle. Detective Morrison was providing professional validation that my actions had been justified and necessary, rather than vindictive or excessive. What should I expect during the prosecution process? The district attorney's office will assign a prosecutor who specializes in domestic violence cases, and you will work with victim advocates who can help you understand court procedures and prepare for testimony. The case will likely take several months to resolve, depending on whether Michael accepts a plea agreement or demands a trial. Detective Morrison explained that domestic violence prosecutions often proceeded even when victims were reluctant to testify, because the evidence in my case was sufficiently strong to support convictions based on witness testimony, medical records, and physical evidence from the crime scene. The presence of Judge Walsh and Dr. Foster as witnesses created an unusually solid foundation for prosecution that did not depend entirely on my willingness to participate in court proceedings. However, she continued, your testimony would significantly strengthen the case and help the court understand the broader context of coercive control that preceded today's assault. Your decision about whether to testify will be entirely up to you, and you will have support regardless of what you choose. As Detective Morrison concluded her interview and prepared to leave the hospital, she provided me with contact information for the victim advocate who would be my primary liaison with the criminal justice system going forward. She also gave me a business card for a family law attorney who specialized in representing domestic violence survivors in custody cases and had experience working with the evidence that criminal investigations could provide. Mrs. Patterson, I have been investigating domestic violence cases for 15 years, and I want you to know that your situation is unusual in several important ways. Most victims do not have the kind of credible witnesses who observed today's assault. Most do not have the documentation you collected to establish patterns of abuse. And most do not have the professional connections that can help them navigate family court proceedings effectively. She paused to ensure that I was following her assessment. What I am telling you is that while the next few months will be challenging, you are in a much stronger position than most women who find themselves in similar circumstances. You have evidence, witnesses, legal resources, and most importantly, you have demonstrated the courage and strategic thinking that will be necessary to protect yourself and Sophia throughout this process. The interview concluded with Detective Morrison's assurance that the investigation would proceed rapidly and that I would be kept informed of all developments that might affect my safety or Sophia's well-being. As she left the hospital, I was alone for the first time since the confrontation in our kitchen, able to process the enormity of what had occurred and what it meant for our future. The physical pain from my injuries was manageable with medication, but the emotional impact of the day's events was more complex. I felt simultaneously exhausted and energized, frightened and empowered, grateful for the support I had received, and overwhelmed by the challenges that lay ahead. But most significantly, I felt something I had not experienced in 8 years: hope. For the first time since my marriage began, I was not alone in dealing with Michael's abuse. Professional advocates were working to ensure my safety, experienced attorneys were preparing to protect my legal rights, and credible witnesses were ready to testify about what they had observed. The birthday party that Michael had intended as a showcase for his authority had become the foundation for my liberation. The witnesses he had assembled to validate his control had instead become the testimony that would ensure justice. The custody papers he had demanded I sign would never be executed, because the events of this afternoon had provided me with evidence that would make his demand for primary custody legally impossible. As I prepared to be discharged from the hospital and begin the process of rebuilding my life as a single mother, I understood that Michael's greatest tactical error had been underestimating both my intelligence and my determination to protect Sophia from the patterns of control and violence that had defined our marriage. The investigation that Detective Morrison had initiated would ultimately reveal the full extent of Michael's systematic abuse, provide the evidence necessary for his conviction on multiple criminal charges, and establish the foundation for a custody arrangement that would prioritize Sophia's safety and emotional development above Michael's desire for control. The machinery of justice had been set in motion, and for the first time in 8 years it was working on my behalf rather than against me. The temporary housing provided by the Colorado Coalition Against Domestic Violence became my first experience of sanctuary in 8 years. The transitional apartment complex was located in a Denver suburb that Michael had never visited, protected by security systems that required electronic access codes, and staffed by professionals who understood the unique challenges faced by women rebuilding their lives after escaping abusive relationships. My assigned victim advocate, Maria Santos, met with me on my second day of residence to begin developing what she called a comprehensive life reconstruction plan. Maria was a former family law attorney who had transitioned to victim advocacy after witnessing the gaps between legal protection and practical survival needs that domestic violence survivors faced when attempting to establish independent lives. Elena, most women in your situation focus initially on the immediate crisis management aspects of leaving an abusive relationship, Maria explained as we sat in her office reviewing the extensive paperwork that would guide my transition to independence. However, your case presents some unique advantages that we can leverage to create long-term stability rather than just short-term safety. Maria had reviewed the police reports, witness statements, and documentation that I had collected throughout my marriage. Her assessment was that Michael's public assault in front of credible witnesses, combined with the evidence of systematic manipulation and coercive control, created an unusually strong foundation for both criminal prosecution and family court proceedings. The challenge will be converting these legal advantages into practical resources that allow you to provide stable housing, consistent income, and emotional security for Sophia while the court cases proceed, Maria continued. This process typically takes 12 to 18 months, and we need to ensure that you have the support systems necessary to sustain this effort throughout that entire period. The conversation revealed the complexity of rebuilding a life that had been deliberately dismantled through years of systematic control. Michael had isolated me from family relationships, professional connections, and financial independence with such thoroughness that my current situation resembled that of someone entering witness protection rather than simply ending a marriage. My first priority is ensuring that Sophia experiences as much stability as possible during this transition, I told Maria. She has been through enough trauma, and I want to minimize any additional disruption to her routine, education, and social relationships. Maria nodded with understanding. Child welfare is always the primary consideration in domestic violence cases, and the court system recognizes that children benefit from maintaining stability in their daily lives, even when their family structure is changing dramatically. We can work with Windward Academy to ensure that Sophia continues attending the same school, and we can arrange for counseling services that will help her process the changes in her family situation. The discussion of Sophia's educational continuity raised important financial considerations. Windward Academy's annual tuition exceeded $30,000, and the private school did not participate in any scholarship programs that might be available to families experiencing economic hardship. My ability to maintain Sophia's enrollment would depend entirely on establishing sufficient income to cover educational expenses that had previously been managed through Michael's law firm partnership distributions. Elena, your master's degree in child psychology provides an excellent foundation for re-establishing professional independence, Maria observed. The Denver area has a significant demand for licensed therapists who specialize in childhood trauma and family systems, and your personal experience with domestic violence dynamics would be valuable in clinical settings that serve similar populations. The suggestion represented a profound shift in how I conceptualized my professional identity. Throughout my marriage, Michael had dismissed my educational background as a relevant hobby rather than legitimate professional qualification. The possibility that my degree could provide the foundation for financial independence and meaningful career development had never been seriously considered within our household. I would need to complete clinical supervision requirements and pass licensing examinations before I could practice independently, I replied. That process typically takes 2 years and requires financial resources for continuing education that I do not currently possess. Maria smiled with the confidence of someone who had helped dozens of women navigate similar challenges. The coalition maintains partnerships with several graduate psychology programs that offer accelerated licensing tracks for domestic violence survivors who want to enter clinical practice. These programs include scholarship funding, supervised clinical placements, and career development support that can significantly reduce both the time and cost of obtaining professional licenses. The conversation continued for 3 hours, covering every aspect of practical life reconstruction, from immediate safety concerns to long-term career planning. Maria provided information about emergency financial assistance, legal aid services, child care resources, educational support programs, and community organizations that specialized in helping domestic violence survivors transition to independent living. But most importantly, Maria helped me understand that my situation, while challenging, was far from hopeless. The evidence that I had collected, the witnesses who had observed Michael's behavior, and the professional connections that had emerged through the criminal investigation created a foundation for success that most women in similar circumstances did not possess. Elena, I want you to understand that your decision to document Michael's behavior and your refusal to sign those custody papers demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking and personal courage that predicts successful outcomes in these situations, Maria said as our meeting concluded. Many women never develop the awareness or collect the evidence that you gathered, and most never find the opportunity to expose their abuser's behavior in front of credible witnesses. The following week brought my first meeting with Rebecca Chen, the family law attorney whom Detective Morrison had recommended for representing my interests in custody proceedings. Rebecca's office was located in downtown Denver, in a building that housed several firms specializing in family law and domestic relations cases. Rebecca had reviewed all available documentation from the criminal investigation before our initial consultation, allowing her to focus immediately on developing strategy for the custody case, rather than spending time establishing the basic facts of Michael's abusive behavior. Elena, based on the evidence available from the criminal investigation, I believe we can seek sole legal and physical custody of Sophia with supervised visitation for Michael, Rebecca began. The presence of Judge Walsh and Dr. Foster as witnesses to his threatening behavior and physical assault creates an exceptionally strong foundation for arguing that unsupervised contact with Sophia would not be in her best interests. Rebecca explained that Colorado family courts operated according to the principle of best interests of the child, which required judges to consider factors including each parent's ability to provide emotional stability, financial support, and safe living environments. Michael's criminal charges, combined with evidence of systematic manipulation and controlling behavior, would weigh heavily against his suitability for primary custody or unsupervised visitation. However, we should expect that Michael will mount an aggressive defense that attempts to characterize the birthday party incident as an isolated occurrence rather than part of a broader pattern of abusive behavior, Rebecca continued. He will likely argue that his legal career demonstrates his commitment to following laws and court orders, that his financial resources enable him to provide superior material advantages for Sophia, and that your lack of independent income makes you a less suitable primary caregiver. The anticipated defense strategy revealed the importance of the documentation I had collected, and the witness testimony that would be available from the criminal case. Without evidence of systematic abuse, Michael's argument about his professional qualifications and financial resources might have been persuasive to a family court judge who was evaluating the case based solely on surface-level factors. Rebecca, I want to ensure that Sophia's emotional well-being is prioritized throughout this process, even if that means accepting some compromises regarding financial support or visitation arrangements, I said. I am not interested in using the custody case to punish Michael, but I am absolutely committed to protecting Sophia from exposure to the controlling and intimidating behavior that defined our marriage. Rebecca's response indicated that my priorities were both realistic and legally sound. Elena, family courts appreciate parents who demonstrate genuine concern for their children's emotional development, rather than using custody proceedings to continue conflicts with former spouses. Your focus on Sophia's well-being, combined with the evidence of Michael's inappropriate behavior, creates an ideal foundation for achieving the custody arrangement that will best serve Sophia's long-term interests. The legal strategy that emerged from our consultation was comprehensive and methodical. Rebecca would file for emergency custody orders that would formalize the temporary arrangements that had been established after Michael's arrest. She would request court-ordered psychological evaluations for both Michael and Sophia to establish professional assessments of their respective emotional states and therapeutic needs. She would also seek financial support orders that would ensure Sophia's material needs were met, while the custody case proceeded through the court system. The psychological evaluations will be conducted by Dr. Patricia Williams, who specializes in family court assessments and has extensive experience with domestic violence cases, Rebecca explained. Dr. Williams will interview both you and Michael, observe Sophia during supervised visits with her father, and provide the court with expert recommendations regarding custody and visitation arrangements that prioritize Sophia's emotional development. The prospect of psychological evaluation was simultaneously reassuring and anxiety-provoking. Professional assessment would provide objective validation of my concerns about Michael's fitness as a primary caregiver, but it would also subject my own parenting capabilities to scrutiny that might reveal areas where Michael's systematic undermining had affected my confidence or effectiveness as a mother. Elena, psychological evaluations in custody cases examine parenting skills, emotional stability, and the ability to prioritize children's needs over personal conflicts, Rebecca said, apparently recognizing my apprehension about the evaluation process. Based on everything I have observed about your decision-making throughout this situation, I am confident that Dr. Williams will find you to be an exemplary parent who has demonstrated remarkable strength and judgment under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. The weeks following my initial meetings with Maria and Rebecca established a routine that balanced the practical demands of single parenthood with the complex requirements of ongoing legal proceedings. Sophia and I developed new daily patterns that provided stability and predictability while accommodating the counseling sessions, court appointments, and case preparation meetings that had become regular features of our lives. Sophia's adjustment to our changed circumstances revealed both her resilience and the extent to which Michael's controlling behavior had affected her understanding of normal family dynamics. During our first family counseling session with Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a child psychologist who specialized in helping children process domestic violence exposure, Sophia expressed confusion about why her father was no longer living with us and concern about whether his absence was somehow her fault. "Daddy got really angry at Mommy during my birthday party," Sophia said during our session. "I heard him shouting and then the police came, and now he cannot live in our house anymore. Did I do something wrong that made Daddy angry?" Dr. Martinez's response demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of childhood psychology that made her particularly effective in helping children process complex family situations. "Sophia, sometimes adults make choices that hurt other people, and when that happens, other adults have to make sure everyone stays safe. The police came to your house because your daddy made a choice that hurt your mommy, not because you did anything wrong." The conversation continued for 45 minutes, with Dr. Martinez helping Sophia understand that adult conflicts were not caused by children's behavior, and that the changes in our family structure were intended to ensure everyone's safety and happiness, rather than to punish anyone for mistakes. "Mommy, are you and Daddy going to live in different houses forever?" Sophia asked as our session concluded. "Yes, sweetheart. Daddy and I have decided that we will be happier and safer living in different places, but you will still get to see both of us and spend time with both of us." "Will Daddy still be angry?" The question revealed Sophia's sophisticated understanding of the emotional dynamics that had characterized our household. Even at 7 years old, she had learned to monitor Michael's moods and adjust her behavior to avoid triggering his anger, a survival strategy that children of abusive parents often develop but that creates long-term emotional and psychological consequences. "Daddy is learning better ways to handle his feelings when he gets upset," Dr. Martinez explained. "And the most important thing for you to remember is that your job is to be a kid, not to worry about grown-up feelings or problems." The counseling sessions became an essential component of Sophia's adjustment process, providing her with professional support for processing the changes in our family while also creating documentation of her emotional well-being that would be valuable for the custody proceedings. Dr. Martinez's notes would demonstrate that Sophia was thriving in our new living situation, and that the stability I was providing was supporting her healthy development. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Michael proceeded through the court system, with the methodical efficiency that characterized domestic violence prosecutions involving clear evidence and credible witnesses. Assistant District Attorney Patricia Rodriguez specialized in domestic violence cases and had reviewed all available evidence before deciding to pursue charges that included third-degree assault, harassment, coercive control, and child endangerment. "Elena, the evidence in your case is exceptionally strong," Patricia explained during our first meeting to discuss the prosecution strategy. Judge Walsh and Dr. Foster provide unimpeachable witness testimony. The security cameras in your house recorded the assault, and the medical documentation of your injuries corroborates the physical violence. Additionally, the custody papers and Michael's documented threats create clear evidence of the coercive control that preceded the assault. Patricia's assessment was that Michael would likely accept a plea agreement rather than risk the professional and personal consequences of a public trial that would expose his abusive behavior to media coverage and legal community scrutiny. However, she was prepared to proceed to trial if necessary to ensure that Michael faced appropriate consequences for his criminal behavior. What would a plea agreement typically include in cases like this? I asked. For domestic violence cases involving professional defendants with no prior criminal history, plea agreements usually include guilty pleas to reduce charges, mandatory counseling for anger management and domestic violence intervention, probationary supervision that includes no contact orders with victims, and community service requirements, Patricia replied. However, given the severity of Michael's behavior and the presence of child endangerment charges, we would also seek restitution for your medical expenses and additional restrictions that protect both you and Sophia from future contact. The prosecution timeline indicated that Michael's case would be resolved within 3 to 6 months, providing closure to the criminal proceedings before the family court custody case reached its conclusion. This sequence was advantageous because Michael's criminal conviction would strengthen our position in custody proceedings, while also establishing legal precedent for the protective orders that would govern any future contact between Michael and our family. As I reflected on the progress that had been achieved during the first month after Michael's arrest, I realized that my decision to refuse signing those custody papers had initiated changes that extended far beyond protecting my immediate parental rights. The confrontation had exposed Michael's true character to professional witnesses whose testimony would ensure justice, activated support systems that I had never known existed, and created opportunities for building a new life based on authentic relationships rather than fear and control. The reconstruction of my life was proceeding according to plans that prioritized Sophia's well-being while also establishing the foundation for my own professional and personal independence. The challenges ahead remained significant, but for the first time in 8 years I was facing those challenges with professional support, legal protection, and the confidence that came from understanding my own capabilities and worth. The birthday party that Michael had intended as a demonstration of his authority had instead become the catalyst for my liberation and Sophia's protection. His attempt to force my submission had revealed his weakness, while my refusal to comply had demonstrated strength that I had never recognized in myself. The family court proceedings that would determine Sophia's custody arrangements began 6 weeks after Michael's arrest, initiating a process that would test every strategic skill I had developed during 8 years of surviving his manipulation. Unlike the criminal case, where Michael's guilt was established through witness testimony and physical evidence, the custody proceedings required demonstrating that his behavior posed ongoing risks to Sophia's emotional development and psychological well-being. Judge Margaret Harrison presided over the Douglas County Family Court, with the methodical precision of someone who had spent 15 years evaluating complex custody disputes. Her reputation within the legal community emphasized thorough analysis of evidence, rather than emotional appeals, a judicial approach that would favor the systematic documentation I had collected over Michael's attempts to minimize his behavior through legal maneuvering. The preliminary hearing established the framework for proceedings that would ultimately determine not only where Sophia would live, but also the broader question of which parent possessed the judgment and emotional stability necessary to guide her development through adolescence and into adulthood. Michael's legal representation had been assumed by Harrison and Associates, a firm that specialized in defending high-profile clients facing criminal charges and family court proceedings that threatened their professional reputations. Attorney David Harrison entered his appearance as Michael's counsel, with the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to protecting wealthy clients from the consequences of their personal failures. His opening statement revealed a defense strategy that would attempt to characterize the birthday party assault as an isolated incident of poor judgment, rather than evidence of systematic abusive behavior that posed ongoing risks to family members. Your Honor, my client acknowledges that the events of March 15th represented a serious lapse in judgment that he deeply regrets, Harrison began, his tone suggesting measured contrition rather than authentic remorse. However, the isolated nature of this incident, combined with Mr. Patterson's exemplary professional record, and his genuine commitment to his daughter's well-being should not overshadow 8 years of dedicated fatherhood and financial provision for his family. The characterization was precisely what Rebecca Chen had anticipated during our case preparation sessions. Michael's defense would focus on minimizing the significance of his criminal behavior while emphasizing his professional achievements and financial capabilities as evidence of his suitability for maintaining substantial custody rights. Rebecca's response demonstrated the strategic advantage that comprehensive documentation provided in custody proceedings. Rather than relying on emotional appeals or unsupported assertions about Michael's character, she methodically presented evidence that established patterns of controlling behavior, financial manipulation, and psychological intimidation that predated the physical assault by several years. Your Honor, the evidence will demonstrate that Mr. Patterson's assault against Mrs. Rodriguez was not an isolated incident of poor judgment, but rather the culmination of a systematic campaign of coercive control that included financial manipulation, social isolation, psychological intimidation, and threats of retaliation designed to prevent Mrs. Rodriguez from seeking legal protection or independent counsel, Rebecca stated, her presentation organized according to the legal standards that govern custody determinations in domestic violence cases. The preliminary evidence presentation consumed the entire morning session, with Rebecca introducing bank records that documented Michael's unauthorized use of my personal accounts, medical records that contained fabricated symptoms designed to support false narratives about my mental health, and communication records that revealed his attempts to undermine my relationships with family members and potential sources of support. Mrs. Rodriguez collected this documentation over a period of 6 months preceding the assault, demonstrating remarkable foresight and strategic thinking that contradicts any suggestion that she lacks the judgment necessary to serve as Sophia's primary caregiver, Rebecca continued, her argument structured to address each element of the legal criteria that Judge Harrison would apply when making custody determinations. The documentation strategy proved more effective than I had anticipated during the months when I questioned whether secretly collecting evidence represented paranoid behavior or reasonable precaution. Judge Harrison examined each document with careful attention to detail, asking clarifying questions that indicated she understood the systematic nature of Michael's manipulation, rather than viewing our marital problems as mutual conflict between equally responsible parties. Mr. Harrison, does your client dispute the authenticity of these financial records indicating unauthorized access to Mrs. Rodriguez's personal accounts? Judge Harrison inquired, her tone suggesting that denying documentary evidence would damage Michael's credibility, rather than supporting his defense strategy. Your Honor, Mr. Patterson had legitimate access to joint marital accounts and made financial decisions that he believed were in the family's best interests, Harrison replied, his response revealing the weakness of attempting to defend systematic financial control as reasonable household management. These records indicate individual accounts that were opened in Mrs. Rodriguez's name without her knowledge or consent, not joint marital accounts, Judge Harrison observed, her correction demonstrating the precision with which she was analyzing the evidence, rather than accepting legal characterizations that contradicted documented facts. The exchange established the tone for proceedings that would prioritize factual accuracy over legal rhetoric, an approach that favored my position because the evidence supporting systematic abuse was comprehensive and verifiable, rather than dependent on subjective interpretations of ambiguous behavior. Dr. Patricia Williams conducted the court-ordered psychological evaluations that would provide professional assessment of each parent's emotional stability, judgment capabilities, and capacity for prioritizing Sophia's developmental needs over personal conflicts. The evaluation process extended over 3 weeks and included individual interviews, psychological testing, observation of parent-child interactions, and review of all available documentation regarding our family dynamics. My individual evaluation sessions with Dr. Williams focused extensively on the decision-making process that led to my refusal to sign the custody papers and the strategic thinking that had enabled me to document Michael's behavior despite the personal risks involved in collecting such evidence. Elena, your ability to recognize the systematic nature of your husband's controlling behavior and to develop long-term strategies for protecting yourself and Sophia demonstrates remarkable psychological resilience and intellectual sophistication, Dr. Williams observed during our final evaluation session. Many domestic violence victims never develop the awareness necessary to understand manipulation tactics or the strategic thinking required to build cases against their abusers. The professional validation was profound, particularly because it came from someone whose expertise in family psychology enabled her to distinguish between genuine capability and superficial presentation. Throughout my marriage, Michael had consistently characterized my intelligence as adequate for basic domestic responsibilities but insufficient for complex decision-making. A narrative that had gradually undermined my confidence in my own judgment and analytical abilities. Dr. Williams, I often questioned whether my interpretation of Michael's behavior was accurate or whether I was becoming paranoid due to the stress of our relationship, I admitted. The isolation made it difficult to maintain perspective about what constituted normal marital conflict versus systematic abuse. Elena, your documentation reveals exactly the kind of systematic pattern that characterizes coercive control relationships, and your decision to collect this evidence demonstrates clear thinking rather than paranoid behavior, Dr. Williams replied. Additionally, your consistent prioritization of Sophia's emotional well-being throughout this crisis shows the kind of maternal judgment that family courts seek when making custody determinations. Dr. Williams' evaluation of Michael revealed psychological characteristics that would prove devastating to his custody case. His individual sessions apparently demonstrated limited insight regarding the impact of his behavior on family members, minimal acceptance of responsibility for the circumstances that led to criminal charges, and continued adherence to controlling attitudes that suggested high risk for future manipulative behavior. Mr. Patterson presents with personality characteristics consistent with narcissistic and controlling behavior patterns that are strongly associated with domestic violence perpetration. Drive, Williams's written evaluation stated. His limited acknowledgement of wrongdoing, combined with his continued focus on his own perceived victimization by the legal process, suggests minimal prospects for meaningful behavior change without intensive therapeutic intervention. The psychological evaluation's most damaging finding concerned Michael's attitudes toward Sophia's autonomy and emotional development. His responses to questions about parenting philosophy revealed expectations that children should prioritize their parents' emotional needs over their own developmental requirements, a perspective that contradicted established principles of healthy child psychology. Mr. Patterson's responses indicate that he views children as extensions of parental identity rather than individuals with independent emotional needs, Dr. Williams continued. This perspective, combined with his demonstrated willingness to use intimidation and control tactics when his authority is challenged, raises significant concerns about his ability to support Sophia's healthy psychological development during adolescence, when increased independence becomes developmentally appropriate. Quote, the supervised visitation sessions that Dr. Williams observed provided additional evidence that supported concerns about Michael's parenting approach. Rather than focusing on Sophia's interests and enjoyment during their limited time together, Michael consistently used visitation sessions to gather information about our living situation, my legal strategy, and my relationships with the professionals who were supporting our transition to independence. Daddy asked me lots of questions about where we live now and who comes to visit us, Sophia reported to Dr. Martinez during one of our family counseling sessions. He wanted to know about the lady who helps Mommy with paperwork and whether Mommy talks on the phone with lawyers. The interrogation approach revealed Michael's continued focus on gathering intelligence that might provide strategic advantages in legal proceedings, rather than prioritizing meaningful connection with Sophia during their supervised visits. Dr. Williams documented these observations as evidence that Michael viewed his daughter primarily as a source of information, rather than recognizing their visits as opportunities for positive relationship building. The contrast between Michael's interrogation sessions and Sophia's spontaneous expressions of comfort in our new living situation provided compelling evidence for my custody case. Sophia's adjustment to our transitional housing had been remarkably smooth, with improvements in her sleep patterns, academic performance, and social relationships that suggested reduced stress rather than trauma from family separation. Sophia exhibits classic signs of relief from chronic household tension, Dr. Martinez noted in her evaluation. Her improved emotional regulation, increased willingness to express preferences and opinions, and enhanced capacity for age-appropriate play behavior all indicate that the current custody arrangement is supporting her healthy development. The comprehensive psychological evaluations concluded with Dr. Williams's recommendation that I be awarded sole legal and physical custody of Sophia, with supervised visitation for Michael that would be gradually expanded only after he completed domestic violence intervention programs and demonstrated sustained behavior change through therapeutic assessment. The evidence indicates that Mrs. Rodriguez possesses the emotional stability, strategic thinking capabilities, and genuine commitment to child welfare that predict successful single parenting, while Mr. Patterson's controlling behavior patterns and limited insight regarding their impact on family members suggest that unsupervised contact with Sophia would not serve her best interests at this time, Dr. Williams's final report concluded. While the psychological evaluations were being completed, I began pursuing the professional development that would provide long-term financial independence and personal fulfillment. The accelerated clinical psychology program that Maria Santos had identified proved ideally suited to my circumstances, offering evening classes that accommodated Sophia's school schedule and supervised clinical training that provided both practical experience and modest income during the certification process. Dr. Rachel Morrison, who directed the program, had extensive experience working with domestic violence survivors who were rebuilding their professional identities after years of systematic undermining by abusive partners. Her approach emphasized rebuilding confidence and intellectual capabilities while developing practical skills that would enable successful clinical practice. Elena, your personal experience with psychological manipulation and coercive control provides valuable insight for working with clients who have experienced similar trauma, Dr. Morrison observed during my program orientation. However, successful clinical practice requires maintaining appropriate professional boundaries between personal experience and therapeutic intervention, and we will work extensively on developing those distinctions. The clinical training component of the program placed me in a community mental health center that specialized in family therapy and domestic violence counseling. Working under supervision with clients who faced circumstances similar to my own provided both professional development and personal validation that my decision to leave Michael had been necessary and appropriate. My first client was Angela Martinez, a 28-year-old mother of two who was considering leaving an emotionally abusive marriage, but feared the financial and legal consequences of separation. Her husband, like Michael, was a professional with significant earning capacity, who had systematically undermined her confidence while creating financial dependence that made independence seem impossible. I know that staying in this marriage is damaging my children, but I do not see how I can support them on my own, Angela confided during our third session. My husband controls all our finances, and he has convinced me that no judge would award custody to a mother without independent income or stable housing. The parallels to my own situation were profound, but the professional training I was receiving enabled me to provide objective guidance, rather than simply sharing personal experience. I helped Angela understand the legal protections available to domestic violence victims, the support services that could assist with transition planning, and the systematic approach to documentation that could strengthen her position in potential custody proceedings. Angela, your concerns about financial independence are legitimate and deserve serious consideration as part of any safety planning process. I responded, my training enabling me to validate her fears while providing factual information about available resources. However, remaining in an abusive relationship to maintain financial stability often creates greater long-term risks for both mothers and children than the temporary challenges of establishing independence. Working with clients like Angela reinforced my understanding that the strategic thinking and documentation skills I had developed during my own crisis could be systematically taught to other women facing similar circumstances. The clinical program was not only providing professional certification, but also developing expertise that could benefit other domestic violence survivors who needed guidance for building cases against manipulative partners. The combination of successful psychological evaluations, Michael's deteriorating legal position, and my growing professional competence created momentum that would ultimately determine the custody proceedings' outcome. Michael's criminal case concluded with a plea agreement that included guilty verdicts on reduced charges, mandatory anger management counseling, and probationary supervision that included no contact orders except for supervised visitation with Sophia. The criminal conviction provided additional evidence for the family court proceedings, demonstrating that Michael's behavior had been evaluated by multiple legal and clinical professionals who had reached consistent conclusions about his use of intimidation and control tactics. Judge Harrison's review of the comprehensive record indicated that the custody decision would be based on extensive documentation, rather than competing personal narratives about marital conflict. The evidence presented in this case establishes clear patterns of coercive control that preceded the criminal assault and created an environment that was not conducive to healthy child development, Judge Harrison observed during the final hearing. Mrs. Rodriguez has demonstrated remarkable resilience, strategic thinking, and genuine commitment to Sophia's well-being throughout extraordinarily difficult circumstances. The custody determination that followed would establish the legal framework for Sophia's future, while validating the courage and strategic thinking that had enabled our escape from Michael's control. The birthday party that he had intended as a demonstration of his authority had instead provided the evidence necessary for ensuring Sophia's safety and my independence. The final custody hearing convened on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 7 months after the birthday party assault that had transformed our family dynamics from private crisis to public legal proceedings. Judge Harrison's courtroom was filled with the accumulated evidence of 8 years of systematic abuse, 6 months of strategic documentation, and countless hours of professional evaluation that would determine Sophia's future living arrangements and my legal standing as her primary caregiver. The comprehensive nature of the evidence presented a stark contrast to the typical custody disputes that relied primarily on competing personal narratives and character assessments. The documentation I had collected, combined with witness testimony from the assault and professional evaluations from multiple clinical experts, created an unusually complete picture of family dynamics that eliminated ambiguity about the most appropriate custody arrangement. Rebecca Chen's final presentation methodically addressed each legal criterion that Judge Harrison would apply when making her determination. The evidence demonstrated my emotional stability through psychological evaluation, my financial capability through the clinical psychology program that was providing current income and future career prospects, and my commitment to Sophia's well-being through consistent prioritization of her emotional development over personal conflicts with Michael. Your Honor, the evidence establishes that Mrs. Rodriguez possesses the judgment, emotional stability, and genuine commitment to child welfare that family courts seek when awarding primary custody. Rebecca stated, her argument supported by comprehensive documentation that eliminated speculation about my parenting capabilities. Additionally, her successful pursuit of professional certification while managing complex legal proceedings demonstrates exactly the kind of strategic thinking and personal resilience that predicts successful single parenting. The presentation included testimony from Dr. Williams regarding the psychological evaluations, documentation from Dr. Martinez regarding Sophia's improved emotional adjustment in our current living situation, and professional references from the clinical psychology program that validated my intellectual capabilities and therapeutic potential. Each element of evidence reinforced the others, creating a comprehensive case that addressed potential concerns about single parenting, while establishing clear advantages for the proposed custody arrangement. Michael's defense attorney attempted to challenge the conclusions drawn from psychological evaluation and to minimize the significance of the criminal conviction that had resulted from the birthday party assault. However, the systematic nature of the evidence made it impossible to characterize Michael's behavior as isolated poor judgment rather than establish patterns of control and intimidation. Mr. Harrison's argument that his client's behavior represented momentary poor judgment is contradicted by extensive documentation of financial manipulation, social isolation, and psychological intimidation that preceded the physical assault by several years, Judge Harrison observed, her analysis demonstrating careful review of all available evidence. The pattern established through Mrs. Rodriguez's documentation, combined with Dr. Williams's clinical assessment, indicates systematic coercive control rather than marital conflict between equally responsible parties. The judicial analysis continued for 30 minutes, addressing each aspect of the custody determination, with the methodical precision that had characterized Judge Harrison's reputation throughout her tenure on the family court bench. Her review of the evidence revealed understanding of domestic violence dynamics that went beyond simple legal technicalities to encompass the broader psychological and emotional factors that would affect Sophia's long-term development. The court finds that Mrs. Rodriguez has demonstrated exceptional judgment and strategic thinking throughout extraordinarily difficult circumstances, while Mr. Patterson's behavior has consistently prioritized his own control and authority over his family's emotional well-being and safety. Judge Harrison continued. The evidence supports awarding sole legal and physical custody to Mrs. Rodriguez, with supervised visitation for Mr. Patterson contingent upon completion of court-ordered domestic violence intervention programs and ongoing therapeutic assessment. The custody determination included specific provisions that addressed my concerns about Michael's potential attempts to continue exercising control through legal manipulation or financial pressure. All decisions regarding Sophia's education, medical care, and extracurricular activities would be made solely by me, eliminating Michael's ability to use shared legal custody as a mechanism for ongoing interference in our daily lives. The supervised visitation arrangement required Michael to complete a minimum of 1 year of domestic violence intervention counseling before being considered for any expansion of his contact with Sophia. Additionally, all visitation would occur at a court-approved facility with trained supervisors who could document Michael's interactions with Sophia and ensure that visits focused on appropriate parent-child activities, rather than gathering intelligence about our living situation or legal strategy. Mr. Patterson's visitation will be supervised by professionals who specialize in domestic violence cases and who are trained to recognize attempts to use children as sources of information about protected family members, Judge Harrison specified. Any evidence that Mr. Patterson is using visitation to gather information about Mrs. Rodriguez or Sophia's living situation will result in immediate suspension of contact pending further court review. The financial support arrangements established through the custody order addressed my concerns about maintaining Sophia's educational continuity while building toward complete independence. Michael would be required to continue paying Windward Academy tuition through Sophia's graduation, provide health insurance coverage, and contribute to a college fund that would be administered through the court system rather than subject to his direct control. The court recognizes that Mrs. Rodriguez is actively pursuing professional certification that will provide long-term financial independence, and the support orders are structured to provide transitional assistance during this educational period rather than creating permanent dependence, Judge Harrison explained. As Mrs. Rodriguez's earning capacity increases through completion of her clinical psychology program, the support obligations will be reviewed and adjusted accordingly. The custody determination concluded with judicial recognition of the courage and strategic thinking that had enabled our escape from Michael's control. Judge Harrison's comments transcended the typical legal language of family court orders to acknowledge the broader significance of my decision to resist signing the custody papers, despite the personal risks involved. Mrs. Rodriguez's refusal to sign the custody modification agreement that precipitated the assault demonstrated remarkable courage and judgment that ultimately protected both her own parental rights and her daughter's future well-being, Judge Harrison stated. Her systematic documentation of coercive control, combined with her strategic approach to building a case against systematic abuse, reflects the kind of intellectual capability and emotional strength that family courts seek to protect and support. The formal custody order was filed within 24 hours of the hearing, establishing legal protection that could not be challenged or modified without clear evidence of substantially changed circumstances. Sophia's future was now legally secured through arrangements that prioritized her emotional development while providing financial support for her education and long-term opportunities. The immediate aftermath of the custody determination brought profound relief, mixed with recognition of the enormous challenges that had been overcome through systematic preparation and strategic thinking. The birthday party assault that had initially seemed like a devastating crisis had ultimately provided the catalyst for legal proceedings that established permanent protection for Sophia and complete independence for me. Sophia's response to learning about the permanent custody arrangement reflected her growing understanding of the family dynamics that had characterized her early childhood. During our family counseling session following the court hearing, she expressed both relief about our continued living together and sadness about the limited nature of her future contact with Michael. "I am happy that I get to stay with you, Mommy, but I wish Daddy could learn to be nicer so we could all be together sometimes," Sophia said, her comment revealing the sophisticated emotional processing that Dr. Martinez's counseling had supported throughout the transition period. "Maybe if Daddy learns better ways to handle his feelings, we could have dinner together sometimes without anyone getting angry." Dr. Martinez used Sophia's comment to reinforce lessons about healthy relationship dynamics and personal safety that would serve her well throughout her development. The counseling sessions had consistently emphasized that adult behavior was not Sophia's responsibility to manage or change, while also validating her natural desire for family harmony and her love for both parents, despite the circumstances that required our separation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.